Well, I'm really privileged here to welcome onto the program David Bahnsen. David's the founder, managing partner, and chief investment officer of the Bahnsen Group, a national private wealth management firm. He's consistently named among the top financial advisors by various outlets like Barron's, Forbes, Financial Times, et cetera. And he and I both appear weekly on The World and Everything in It, a world podcast. I do something called Culture Friday, and David is constantly hitting the economic side of things. David, we don't usually talk much about economics here on Breakpoint or Breakpoint This Week, mainly because it's way above my pay grade. But economics is a worldview issue because everything is a worldview issue. And after what happened Monday, actually coming out of the weekend, you started to hear all kinds of imminent threats of what was going to happen on Monday in terms of a big sell-off. And I really appreciated your piece. In World Opinions, you identified, three very clear factors that were behind what was a pretty dramatic sell-off in the market on Monday morning. And just, I wanted to chat with you, as I thought, who knows about this stuff? You were the first on my list. So first of all, thanks for agreeing to come on and talk about this.
Well, thank you for having me and for the kind words. And I will say, with the wonderful work on worldview that Breakpoint is doing, economics has to be a part of that. There shouldn't be economics without worldview, but ultimately there isn't worldview without economics as well. So they work together.
No, that's right, and I want to get into that too. But let's start just quickly with what happened on Monday. Give us the rundown.
Yeah, I think it's kind of important to note that it's really more than just Monday, because markets had gotten hit hard Thursday and Friday as well. And what I think made Monday a little more dramatic was that in the U.S. markets, it would have been the third day in a row, but that it was coming off of what to us was Sunday night, but was to Asia Monday, was Japan's market dropping 12.5% in one day. So far this week, as you and I are talking, Japan had its worst day ever since 1987 on Monday, and they had their best day ever on Tuesday, their recovery back. So that's the kind of volatility we're dealing with in global markets internationally. And so a lot of people seeing the futures Sunday night, which is night before market action that we can see and I'll spare everyone the wonky details of how that's done. I think people could have assumed that the U.S. markets looked like they were going to open down Monday because it was a follow-up of what had been going on Thursday and Friday, which were more U.S.-centric problems in the economy and in the market. But then by Monday morning, it was very clear, oh no, now what's hitting us is a follow-up from what's happening in Asia. And so that's why in World, I kind of described it as three different things, and I'm convinced I'm right about those three. But I also believe that the sequence was important, that's like in order of priority. And so number one on Monday was what's called the yen carry trade. The Japanese yen has been a very weak currency. It yields very little. Therefore, it's very cheap to borrow, and then you can go buy other things with cheap borrowed yen. And it's a way to take more risk for international investors to borrow in yen and buy other investments they may want to own. The yen rallied substantially, one of the biggest 5-day rallies against the dollar ever. And the Bank of Japan announced a small quarter-point rate hike that was unexpected. And it just caused all of these people who had borrowed to have to panic sell. So that's what we're talking about when we use terms like an unwind of a yen carry trade. If I said to my wife, she just ignores it, like, I don't know what you're talking about. And I get it. The language may sound a little bit mysterious, but that's what we're talking about, is a whole lot of people, hundreds of billions of dollars, were caught off sides by borrowing in the Japanese currency and having to panic sell. That's the primary driver of Monday. However, it took place in the same course of the U.S. markets already having started to correct in the NASDAQ, our big tech companies. Some of these that have had a big move up lately, like NVIDIA and Microsoft. The NASDAQ had actually been going down since July 10th. So it had been almost 3-4 weeks already. And as of Monday, the NASDAQ was down 13.5% from its high. And so it was a kind of secondary story. It's one I believe, and I'm quite on record as saying, very likely has a long way to go. It could very well rally like it has the last couple of days since Monday. It's going to be up and down, but we just have way overdone this AI story, this artificial intelligence mania. And I think there's a lot more correction to potentially come out of these overvalued tech stocks. And then it leaves us with the third thing, John, which is the economy. It's just essentially markets have been in a pretty good wave for a long time of knowing that the Fed was basically done raising rates. It's been over a year. It was July of last summer when they last raised rates, and yet that the economy had not gone into recession. Now we have known for some time that we're getting closer and closer to the Fed cutting rates, and we still never really saw unemployment go up that much. Credit conditions tighten too much, not a lot of economic deterioration. So it's what we call Goldilocks, this sort of not too hot, not too cold, everything kind of worked out. Well, now people are worried, okay, the economy is slowing a little bit. Maybe it's not recessionary, but you had a really bad jobs report on Friday. And it wasn't a great one the month before either. So now the narrative gets into markets of maybe the economy is slowing going into next year. Our tech sector is overvalued. And it's the last thing we need is to have this yen carry trade going on. All of those things converged into about a 24-hour period.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think was really helpful is that this is three factors. You don't get quite the panic without all three factors kind of showing up at the same time, a little bit of a perfect storm. But on the worldview side of this, especially from a Christian worldview perspective, there were two things in particular that I thought were really helpful. The politicization, everything being about politics. Obviously everyone went to Twitter, or X now, the source of all truth, in the Western world, and proclaimed this is Trump's fault. This is Kamala's fault. Immediately going to these political, reasons. You came out and said, it's not either one of them. To what degree can we blame it on either political party at this point?
Well, let's answer it two different ways. First, how can we blame this volatility, these big sell-offs and big rallies on the political side? The answer is not at all. Not like 10%, 5%, 20%. I mean 0%. Now, by the way, it's self-evident. Are we to believe markets dropped 1,000 points Monday because we were afraid of Kamala Harris, and it went up 1,000 points Tuesday because we weren't afraid of Kamala Harris? And then it's not related on up and down movement to politics. It's an incoherent idea. But even when you get rid of the volatility of it, then the more deep issue of, well, this candidate's good for the market, this candidate's bad for the market, I would argue there can be some truth in that. Markets like tax cuts and markets like deregulation and markets like a pro-business agenda, whatever that may look like. But markets also are well aware of an American form of government. That the fact of the matter is, I don't consider former President Barack Obama to have been particularly friendly to markets. The market was up 8 out of 8 years that he was president. He happened to take over at the bottom of a generational sell-off in markets from the financial crisis. So the timing was quite nice that you're picking up at a very low level. And yet divided government, sometimes a president may want to raise taxes. President Biden tried to do that in 2021, and the markets never believed it. The Build Back Better was $5 trillion of tax increases. It never became law. So the news argued about it all year. Pundits and politically interested people, citizens, we all discussed it. I know I did. But markets knew that the Senate had to pass it. The House had to pass it. And that's where, for most of my life, Reagan, Tip O'Neill, Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich, Obama, John Boehner, even Joe Manchin with President Biden, because technically President Biden had a Democrat majority in the Senate, but there were a couple moderates that kept some of those things from going on. And that's why markets right now are not saying we like Trump and we don't like Kamala or vice versa. Markets are saying the Senate, the House, the presidency, all three are going to be close. And therefore, it becomes very hard for markets to sort of price some of that in. I'm very open to the fact that there's specifics along the way. Let's say I had a crystal ball and knew that a certain candidate was going to win who wanted to increase export of liquefied natural gas. Then I think that sector could start to price some of those things in. But even then, you need Senate approval because there's committees and other technicalities in American form of government. So just as there's nuance in our civics, there's nuance in our markets.
And there's realities about the human condition. And you've written about that in a new book called Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And I want to get to that here in a second, because I think a lot of times, and this goes to the second thing that I think really made me want to have this conversation right now. It had been a while since the economic news or a particular event like what happened, as you described it, these three factors coming out emerging over the weekend, kind of hitting this perfect storm, created the level of panic. I mean, there's a lot of panic on Monday. And of course, a lot of that panic comes, maybe not with you. You were probably, sitting back saying, okay, how do I navigate this? But for the average person, a lot of people check their retirement accounts. Bad idea to do on Monday, right? And a lot of people watch the news. Another bad idea to do on Monday when, the panicked headlines about this unprecedented sell-off. And I appreciated a handful of commentaries, National Review, some others that, just clarified, look, this, the last time this happened was 2022. It really wasn't that far ago, at least percentage-wise.
And it's not in the top 100.
That's an important point.
Not even in the top
100.
Even not in the top 10 is important, but not in the top 100. And so it's funny. My 14-year-old son, who's my youngest, he was saying, Dad, market down 1,000 points, is this the worst, whatever? And I was talking to him about the market was down 777 points in September 2008, and that was significantly worse. And he said, well, what do you mean? It's over 1,000 today. And I said, let's do a little math. If we're down 777 points when the Dow was at 10,000, you're talking about 7 or 8%. And if you're talking about being down 1,000 points when the Dow's at 40,000, you're talking about 2 to 2.5%, right? And that's forgotten too. And the media wants it to be forgotten because I admit the drama of saying 1,000 points is much better than saying 2%.
Yeah. And it's that fear aspect that I think has to speak to us as followers of Christ, right? I mean, when scripture says that fear of the Lord casts out all other fear, that's got to include economic fears. And, this emerges too. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because I think a lot of it has to do with getting past the hype and getting to the realities of the market, the realities of the numbers, like you said. And also then just what are we required to believe and think as followers of Christ in relation to kind of fears of the market?
Yeah, well, it's not my view that Christians necessarily have to be in the market. I do believe Christians' investment plans and parable of the talents principles should mean that they're invested in human productivity. And so I am a big fan in trying to tether our future investment to our God-created capacity for co-creation and productivity and innovation. And it is true that generally takes the form and risk-taking of things that are more equity-like than defensive. But that's a broader conversation maybe for another day. But yes, the general framework you're describing, I think, is very important sociologically. Whether it's fear of a market sell-off or fear of a political election outcome, the general framework of Christians living in fear and despair is unacceptable in a biblical worldview. And fear not is the commandment repeated most in Scripture. Out of every other commandment, being told not to be afraid. Now, that doesn't mean you should go stand in the middle of a railroad track and not be afraid, but however, I do think it's important when you have a perspective, a sort of sober judgment that comes from the Christian understanding of God's sovereignty, of control, of when you have sensible plans in place, understanding that there's unpredictabilities in the world that are going to come up and that those things don't dislodge us. And so I don't want to be guilty of taking biblical language and biblical concepts and misapplying them to a bad portfolio. People who have a bad portfolio should try to get a good portfolio. And that, again, that's a whole other conversation. But yes, good plans, good portfolios, our general plans that we do in life are always subject to unpredictable things, and we should not be undone in fear in those moments.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. I remember that movie Bruce Almighty, when Jim Carrey has this wonderful revelation moment and then gets hit by a truck and he's like, God, he's like, well, you still can't stand in the middle of the road. Like, still don't do stupid things. Right. But what we're talking about here is going back on things that are in a sense real, and getting back to what's really real. And just here as we close out the conversation, your book on work, I think, gets to that. There's a handful of things that I think in the days currently, but also in the days ahead, are really going to distinguish Christians being different. We've quoted Tom Holland, the historian, the British historian, a number of times, who in his study of the early church recommended to Christians today, you got to stay weird. You got to stay weird. And how we approach work in the West has been a headline, pre-COVID, but certainly coming out of the COVID, the Great Reset, the Great Resignation, all those sorts of things. Just most people don't like their work. Most people don't think work as being something that's inherent to meaning. And the title of your book, you specifically connect work and the meaning of life. That's the subtitle. The book, again, Full-Time Work and the Meaning of Life. And I just really appreciated your focus on this. A lot of Christians have written on work in the past, not nearly enough, but I'm not sure that it's trickled down into the everyday pew. And I just want to give you a chance here just to give us your thesis in a nutshell. Do you agree that work is going to be one of those ways that Christians are weird, in the days ahead, if we really get to the heart of what God created us for?
Yes, I very much do. I have agreed with it, believed it, advocated for such for a long time. That it is, to me, the lowest hanging fruit for those of us, and this is, of course, at the very heart of what the Colson Center has always been about. For those of us who believe in cultural impact, influence, the kingdom of God being a matter of all of these endeavors that God has created, that he cares about, that the marketplace to me is the most fertile soil for Christians to do the work of the kingdom, to stand out. There are areas in which it can be weird because, for one thing, these days it might be weird to tell the truth. It may be weird to understand basic human anthropology. It may be weird to be faithful to your spouse. There's all kinds of things in which certain virtues, character traits that are unique to Christians represent a positive differentiation. But I also would say that if we are doing our jobs right, this is the essence of the book. It is not, we will not be weird. We will not stand out. We will not move the needle in the culture only because we bring the most honesty to work, although I hope we do. We will also need to bring the most technique, the most productivity, the most innovation, the most hustle, grit. I think basically being the top performers in our work is a moral calling. And that's what the heart of the book is that there is morality and obedience in performance and achievement. And we are not merely ignoring that message. We are preaching the opposite. We are saying, you know what, it's time to quit worrying about what we do and just sort of sit back and focus on a very quiet, unproductive, unremarkable life. And I believe that what we've done in that, even though, thank God, we're not saying that about other domains. There's more and more Christians saying something very different about politics or about education. But in the marketplace, where most people spend most of their time, there is an opportunity for incredible cultural conquest and influence. And I believe that we have to understand creationally why God made us to that higher calling and the opportunity it represents for us in the future, as you talk about.
Wow. Look, I think that call for excellence right there is profound. It is unique to your book because that's not something you hear. You actually hear a lot, I think, a lot of excusing of kind of underperforming or just getting by or riding below the radar. And I think of a guy like Jack Phillips, whose journey and work has taken him to, the Supreme Court, just in terms of his moral convictions. But he makes really good cakes. I don't know if you've ever had one. You should. They're brown. I just got a brownie from him the other day. It'll change your life, sort of thing. And that sort of excellence wedded. But I think it also will do something too to mitigate the sort of panic we saw Monday. Like if you kind of approach what you're doing day in and day out, relying on really the image of God that has been created in you and redeemed in Christ, like I think some of these other factors maybe won't rattle us as much. Maybe
I completely agree, and so there is a sense in which that basic obedience creates the built-in resilience. We want to be. Nassim Taleb made popular this term anti-fragile. We don't want to be fragile. We want to be anti-fragile in the sense of when we're attacked, when we're hated. Tough times that come up in the economy or the market or life in general. But that anti-fragility does come from us stepping up and acting, taking action, doing things. And that faithful obedience to me starts in the Garden of Eden, understanding what God made us for. And the belief that mankind was made fundamentally to rest and recreate, but has to work just to get by. I can live with hearing that awful message in the world. I cannot live hearing that message in the church.
Oh, so much more to say. David Bahnsen, thank you so much for bringing a little clarity to the chaos of the early week. Thanks for that worldview spin or grounding. So helpful. You can catch David's column at World Opinions. He contributes there. You can also catch his weekly appearance on the World and Everything in It podcast. And David, where else can folks find your stuff?
Well, the book website is fulltimebook.com, fulltimebook.com. And then from there, there's other links and information where if people want to follow other economic stuff I'm doing and whatnot, they could follow along. It's all available there at fulltimebook.com.
I appreciate that. David Bahnsen, thanks so much for being a part here of our conversation on Breakpoint.
Thanks so much.